Welcome back to the Timur Podcast. Finally! We're finally back after like a month of radio silence on my end. We're back. So I figured before we dive into this, I owe you a real quick recap of my life and why I haven't been able to get many episodes out. That's on me. First thing first, I had to switch jobs, which turned out to be a huge headache. And with that came a few financial troubles. But it did get worked out, sort of. I'm not at my dream job. I'm basically a cabin boy on an old Spanish galleon. But, you know, it pays the bills. So that was kind of problematic. And on top of all this, I was sick for about half a month. Pretty badly, too. In fact, the sickest day was also my first day on the new job. It was just awful. I hated my life. I wanted to die, but made it through. Got through all of that. January was stressful with all of that going on. And then on top of it all, my wife came to me pretty sheepishly. That's the right word. And she asked me, "Hey, what if we adopted a puppy?" And 4 days later, we had a puppy. So now I have a puppy, a new job, and thankfully I'm not sick anymore. But all that to say, things were pretty hectic on my end, so I apologize for not getting episodes out in, what has it been? Over a month. I think January 11th or 14th or something like that was the last time I got an episode out. I'm sorry about that. Life has taken a couple bad turns on my end, but things are looking better now. It is chaos, but it is predictable chaos, so I think we're looking okay? So thank you for sticking with me. Thanks for your encouragement. I received a couple notes just kind of checking in, like, hey, what's going on? Are you still doing this thing? Yes, we're still doing this thing. It just hit a few speed bumps. Okay. With all of that said, let's look at kind of where we're headed, so we're all on the same page. It's been a while, right? I've missed you, okay? So let's get on the same page. I posted on Twitter and Facebook yesterday, I think, about our schedule for the next couple of weeks. And in case you didn't see it, or in case this is your first time listening, by the way, if this is your first time listening, welcome. We're glad you're here. And here's where we are and where we're going with the story. In order to lay the groundwork for Timur and understand the world he was born into, we're looking briefly at the formation and the fall of the Mongol Empire, and the fragmentation of said empire into 4 separate parts. And these parts are often referred to as the uluses or khanates, which we're calling them. And these khanates will lead us, historically speaking, right into the birth of Timur. So right now we're going Khanate to Khanate, making sure we've got the basics down. We looked at Khanate number 1, the Yuan dynasty, 2 episodes ago, which was like 17 years ago, but 2 episodes ago. Last week we took a look at Khanate number 2. Did I write last week? Jeez, come on, it was last month. Last episode we took a look at Khanate number 2, the Golden Horde, and this week, today, finally, we're going to hop back into it and look at Khanate number 3, the Ilkhanate. I know, they're similar words, but we'll cover that. And remember that this numbering system isn't a chronological list. All 4 Khanates are coexisting at the time, but we're just proceeding this way from Khanate to Khanate to avoid as much confusion, trying to keep things somewhat categorized because, as you know, this can be a confusing time in history. Seemingly, everybody calls themselves a Khan, everybody is named Timur or some alteration of that name, and everybody is biased as hell when writing about the events. So, yeah, anyway, next episode we will be covering a subject that is a bit of a surprise, but I'm looking forward to it in a way that, well, it's a depressing episode, but very interesting. And if you know about the 14th century, you probably know what's coming. I've hinted at it last episode, and I will hint at it again today, so stay tuned for that. It'll be an interesting episode. The episode after that, so in 2 weeks, we will look at the 4th and most important Khanate to the story of Timur, and this is, of course, the Chagatai Khanate, for it's in this region, the region of the Chagatai Khanate, that Timur will be born. And now I may have to break that episode into 2 parts, as I want to make sure we understand the politics in this region, because here is the deal. And I know I've said this before, but let me reiterate. Timur's early life and his rise to power are the most confusing portions of his entire story. but nevertheless, obviously, some of the most important parts. But it gets really confusing, and the deeper you dive into this time period, the more questions pop up, and it doesn't help that pretty much every guy who wrote about this part of Timur's life, every primary source that we have, at least, has sort of an entirely different take on it than all the other guys, because they're wrong, obviously. Truth blends into legend, and legend goes back to truth and back and forth, and this way and that way. Anyway, we will get there. We will make it through, but we may take 2 episodes on the pretext to this, because we need to understand it. But after that, we will arrive to the birth of Timur, and boy, am I ready for it. If you haven't enjoyed my style of sort of broadly brushing over centuries of history in just a few paragraphs, do not worry. We're really going to dive into the weeds once Timur is on the scene, but we will do so in a good way, a good type of diving into the weeds. And it will not be boring, let me just say that. So with this long intro out of the way, I think you and I are on the same page, or at least close enough, so let's dive into the history. The Ilkhanate, to me, is the most fascinating of all 4 Khanates. And here's why I think that. Of all 4 Khanates, the Ilkhanate lasted the shortest. Whereas you have parts of the other 3 living on for at least a century or 2, and in some cases, all the way up until like the 17 or 1800s, the Ilkhanate is gone. And I mean gone within 100 years of its creation. So already we have this murder mystery sort of thing set up. Why and how did such a powerful wing of the Mongol Empire disappear so quickly? Well, we're going to find out. But also something I find interesting, and this is obviously correlated to what we just said, but the Ilkhanate is the Khanate that you probably hear the least about. Now, obviously this is pretty subjective, and obviously it sort of makes sense because, yeah, it lived the shortest, so we don't hear about it that often, but look, I had a good education growing up, and I barely learned about the history of the Mongol Empire, and certainly didn't learn about the 4 Khanates. But then as I went through college and sort of poked my head about a bit, I began to see some people talking about the Golden Horde, especially when talking about the formulation of Russia, because you don't have Russia without the history of the Golden Horde. And then there were some people talking about the Yuan dynasty, because that's a pretty critical part of Chinese history. And then if you really push into the corners of neglected history, you'll sometimes hear about the Chagatai Khanate, largely due to Timur, because of course that is where he will emerge from into history. But very, very few people seem to ever really be talking about the Ilkhanate. And like I said, I know this is pretty subjective. Maybe there's this huge Ilkhanate book club with tens of thousands of members that I'm just not aware of, but I'm gonna take a guess that most of us haven't heard much about it. But here's where things get even more interesting. Every empire has its strengths and its weaknesses, and good rulers and bad rulers, but one thing that surprised me is that the Ilkhanate's first Ilkhan, or leader, or Khan basically, he was a pretty effective guy. But the Ilkhanate's last ruler, well, he was also a pretty incredible ruler as well. So what happened? We've got a murder mystery, and the murder victim, well, he isn't really well known to begin with, and further, he at least on paper seems like a pretty competent guy. So let's solve this case. To begin, let's look... Oh great, my neighbors... As soon as I start that sentence, my neighbors start, I don't know, running the bathwater or something. Well, just bear with me. Let's look at the name. The Ilkhanate simply means the lesser Khanate, or the subordinate Khanate, meaning that it recognizes that it is a part of the much larger empire. Maybe in name only, but if you'll remember from our episodes on Monk Khan and Kublai Khan, with all the various civil wars that plagued the Mongol Empire after Monk's death, the Ilkhanate was pretty much always loyal to Kublai and then to Timur Khan, way over in China. And thus, the leaders of the Ilkhanate, they liked to call themselves the Ilkhans, which basically means a Khan who submits, or a subordinate Khan. So now that we have that name, the name sort of understood, let's look at where exactly the Ilkhanate was geographically positioned. Well, at its height, it covered what is today Eastern Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, northern Syria, Iraq, Iran, parts of Afghanistan, parts of Pakistan, and parts of Turkmenistan. So it was a pretty big empire. the roughly eastern half of this empire was taken during the campaigns of Genghis Khan and Ogedai, way back at the beginning of this story. And you'll remember, hopefully, that the powerhouse of the day in much of these regions was the mighty Khwarezmian Empire. And it was an up-and-coming Islamic dynasty that made the mistake of killing a few Mongol diplomats. And this is just a quick reminder here, don't kill Mongol diplomats. So the Mongols, of course, under Genghis Khan, they come sweeping through, killing, sacking, and destroying much of Iran and firmly planting the land under their rule. But before the 1250s, that was about it, actually. Sure, there were regular raiding parties that traveled west further into the heartland of the Middle East, taking slaves and loot and whatnot, but westward expansion more or less halted as the Mongols started focusing on the east over in China and Russia and Europe and places like that. But there were some problems here. First of all, in the land of Persia, where it had been conquered by the Mongols, although the Khwarezmian Empire had been taken out, there were still rebellions flaring up claiming that they were reviving the old empire and were eager to throw off the Mongol chains. So in eastern Iran or Persia and much of Central Asia, the Mongols had to be constantly putting out these fires because there was this rising idea of a Neo-Khwarezmian Empire, as one historian puts it. These ideas just would not die. All these people were just rising up, saying that they were going to restore the Khwarezmian Empire and kick the Mongols out. And here's the thing. The local Mongol rulers who were told to, rule over this land, they were not helping the situation. Many of them, a lot of them, were eager to extort and steal from the Persian and Turkish people as much as possible. Now remember that this whole region has been sacked and robbed in a brutal and bloody invasion that it killed millions of people, right? The Mongol invasion of Persia remains one of the bloodiest invasions in history, and we still can't really even get close to agreeing on the ultimate death toll for this invasion. And so after this invasion, the Mongol rulers who are set over this land, they're trying to steal and grab the scraps left from the peoples who have just had everything taken from them. So yeah, you can bet that when some Persian noble proclaims, hey, enough is enough, we need to throw out these Mongolian thieves, people are gonna listen. And add to this that the whole invasion has just smashed all sorts of different ethnic and religious groups together. So you've got Nestorian Christians and Buddhists hating on the Muslim majority, and you've got Muslims furious that they're being ruled by who they see as these pagan heretics, and so on and so forth. Things are not looking too peachy. Oh, and also remember that the collapse of the Khwarezmian Empire at the hand of the Mongols, it has sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, based in Baghdad, the various Turkic sultanates scattered throughout Anatolia, the Ismaili Hashashin, or the Assassins in western Iran, the Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt, they're all freaking out because now they too are situated right next to the Mongols. So all of these people, they start preparing for war, and maybe even tossing a bit of help here and there to the Persian rebels who are trying to rebel against the Mongols over in Iran. All this to say, this new Mongol territory is under a lot of threats and stress from the inside and the outside. And this is sort of the situation from 1231, with the collapse of the Khwarezmian Empire, to about the mid-1250s. There are different Mongol rulers in the area placed there by the Great Khan, whoever that would be at the time. Some of these local rulers are more effective than others, but generally the situation is just always bad for the Mongols. So we're not going to get into these few decades too much more, because it's a lot of the same. It's a lot of the Mongol rulers are trying to steal as much in taxation as they can from these people who they've already suffered way too much. And then you have all these people who want to overthrow the Mongols who are ruling over them. And then you have all these outside threats like the Egyptians and the Caliphate and all the various Turkish sultanates. They want to maybe defend against the Mongols or maybe a preemptive strike. Okay, I'm talking too fast. I've had too much coffee. My neighbors above me are dancing. I don't even know what they're doing, but they're making a whole lot of noise. We're going to slow down. Are you with me? Okay. Deep breath. So, Mongol Persia doesn't look good. Yes, James, you've said that like 17 times. Okay, let's move on. Monk Khan is now the new Khan. And he's one of those true Mongols that we've talked about. Not ethnically speaking, although he was that too, but we're talking idealistically. He's a true Mongol, a warrior of the steppes, a man who was raised in the bloodshed of conquest, a man who upholds the yasa or code of laws and the traditions of his ancestors, and he is not going to stand for any part of this empire slipping out of his control. And this is pretty much where the story of the Ilkhanate officially starts. It started, okay, fine, in 1231 when Genghis conquered the Khwarezmian Empire, but that was, we're not gonna cover that as much because it's a lot of the same, like I spent the last 20 minutes explaining. So now, the year is 1255, and Monk tells his brother, a man named Hulagu, you are going to go west. And I'm going to give you everything you need to kick the crap out of anybody and everybody who raises their fist to the Khan of Khans, the ruler of the world. Now that's paraphrased, of course, but look, this was no joke. Hulagu was heading west and he was given 3 targets to take out. And a lot of other things, but these are the main 3 targets. First of all, take out the assassins hiding in the mountains. And remember, these assassins were, we've talked about this before, they were basically sort of a cult of Ismaili Muslims who used dirtier tactics like assassination or bribery to achieve their political goals, and also may have sent an assassin to take out the Great Khan himself. I mean, that's debatable, but they might have done that. Also, they're sort of in the Mongols' way, so they gotta go. The second target that Monk gave his brother Hulagu was, look, you have to either subjugate or destroy. Oh my gosh, indigestion. He didn't say that. He said, no, you must destroy the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. And finally, your third target, you have to take Syria and Egypt and destroy the Ayyubid dynasty that rules there. And we'll talk about them more. If that's a name that you don't recognize, don't worry, we'll get there. Anyway, to do this, Monk gives his brother Hulagu a fifth of all Mongol and allied forces, a number that very well could have been in the hundreds of thousands, and also very well could have been the largest Mongol army ever assembled. And this includes hordes of horse archers, of course, but also Chinese infantry, Persian archers, Chinese catapults and engineers. Later, there were Georgian and Armenian heavy cavalry knights. This was an elite force and probably, at this time, the finest army in the world. So Hulagu marches west, and nothing can stop him. First up are these petty ideas of reforming a Neo-Khwarezmian Empire in Persia. Yeah, they are stomped out once and for all. You are now under Mongolian rule, whether you like it or not. This land of Persia, of Eastern Iran, whatever you want to call it, this belongs to the Mongols. But look, this is actually not all bad. In fact, now that Hulagu, the brother of the Great Khan, is actually here and close by, a lot of these corrupt local leaders start to get back into line because it's harder to steal taxes when the largest Mongol army ever assembled is right outside your door. It might make you think for a second or two before you do that. Further, Hulagu alleviates a lot of the religious discord by standing up for religious minorities. He himself is a Buddhist, and so obviously he greatly favors Buddhists in this area and helps them out quite a bit financially and with protection and whatnot. But in addition, Hulagu's favorite wife, his best general, and his mother were all devout Christians. And this means that Hulagu develops a huge sympathy for Christianity. In fact, Hulagu allowed for his top officials and leaders and generals, whoever were Christians, he allowed them to hold mass in his presence, and sometimes would even ask Christian priests to bless his soldiers and even weapons before going into battle. Why is this important? Well, there are quite a few Christians in the Middle East at this point. Christians who have long been fighting the Islamic states that Hulagu has been ordered to destroy, such as the Caliphate in Baghdad or the Ayyubids in Syria and Egypt. You have Georgians, Armenians, Crusaders, all Christians with powerful soldiers, and they are eager to join up with the Mongols to sandwich, flank, surround, and defeat the Muslims once and for all. Now, the Georgians and Armenians, they have been subjugated by the Mongols for about 20 years now, but they're still eager to join up in the fight against Islam. And the Crusaders along the coast of the Levant also decide that now it might be a good time to throw in their lot with the Mongols. Now, okay, I gotta take a minute here. I didn't write this in the script, but reading this through, I need to make a point, and that is, anytime in the medieval era, when you're looking at these conflicts with strong religious ties, such as the Crusades, those might be some of the easiest to identify, but even this, where we're looking at Christian forces joining up with the Mongols to defeat Muslims, I say that because it's easy to categorize, but the truth is that this was far more complicated. It was never black and white like Christians versus Muslims. It was very intermingled. What I mean here is that it was a Christian state, such as these various Crusader states, who no doubt had Muslims and Jews and pagans and Christians living within them, but it was the state, a Christian state, trying to destroy an Islamic state like the Caliphate, which of course no doubt had Christians and Jews and Muslims and pagans living within their borders. So when I say Christians versus Muslims or pagans versus Christians or something like that, just know that I'm usually referring to the state and the state's official stance on that religion. I am in no way meaning that every single Christian is trying to defeat every single Muslim. That's absurd. I mean, if you want to kind of look at how complicated these religious scenarios can be, just look at the history of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, in the Middle East with things like, in the Middle Ages, with things like the Reconquista, and you will oftentimes find different Islamic and Christian princes and lords allying together to defeat other Christian and Muslim lords. Now, I'm not saying that religion played no part in this, because obviously that's not true, but it's way more complicated than saying it was Christians versus Muslims. It's more complicated than that. Anyway, I just wanted to make that point clear, just so we all understand that there were many people of all faiths and ethnicities living in all of these political entities. Okay, with that, let's get on with it. So, with all that, the situation is looking just awful for the Islamic powers in the region. There it is, Islamic powers, the political structures. But things just get worse. First of all, Hulagu defeats the Muslim Lars people in southern Iran. Then he destroys the Assassins in the year 1256. And in 1257, the Mongols are approaching the Abbasid Caliphate in Iraq. And a lot of this is review, I know that. But again, Hulagu, again, for people who may be new, and this is in review, if you want to hear more about these conflicts, head back a few episodes to, I don't remember which one it is. That's a terrible host thing to say, but good luck finding it. Okay, moving on. So, Hulagu gets to the Caliphate, and he demands that the Caliph surrender. The Caliph refuses, and long story short, the Mongols annihilate the Abbasid army in battle. They begin the siege of Baghdad in late 1257, and within 3 months, which is a very short time for a siege in medieval combat, within 3 months, the city falls and is pretty much flattened. Anywhere between 90,000 and 2 million civilians were slaughtered. I want to say really quick that you will see numbers for the death toll of the sack of Baghdad anywhere in between 90,000 and 2 million. Historians back then and historians today disagree about it. What I've found to be the most compelling is numbers around the 200,000 mark, somewhere in between 1 and 200,000, which I'm not saying this is a large number. Well, it is a large number. I'm not saying this is a small number. Obviously, this is horrendous. I'm just saying that this is probably the number that's most accurate, is between 1 and 200,000 people. So, and again, the number, it's not really important. Regardless of what the number is, it was absolute genocide. Most of the population of the city was flat out slaughtered. The Grand Library of Baghdad is burned to the ground, and if you remember, the famous quote is that the Mongols were throwing all of these books into the Tigris River, and the river was red with blood and black from ink. That's probably the quote you will hear the most about the sack of Baghdad, and it just gives you this horrible picture in your head of just the level of destruction that this sack was. It's hard to imagine. Anyway, the city is looted and burned, and through this all, the Caliph is captured, and he's forced to watch this all before being rolled into a carpet and stomped to death by Mongol horsemen. And this is because the Mongols believed that the shedding of blood of any royal member, like a king or a prince, that was an insult to kind of the way things were meant to be. No king should kill another king in a way that king's blood is shed. I think they believed it was an insult to the earth to have royal blood fall on it, something like that. So very rarely did Mongols decapitate people, important people. Usually they executed them through things like crushing. And in this case, that is the case. He is rolled into a carpet and crushed to death by horses. And this marks the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. And again, a lot of that is review. We've gone over that before, I believe, in the episode on Monk Khan. There we go. That's a better memory trick. What a terrible sentence. Anyway, this brings me to, well, I got to take a quick pause here to bring up a different subject. And if this little segment sounds different, well, just know that I'm pissed off, and this is happening about 2 hours after I've recorded this whole episode. But this little segment I had was somehow deleted in the editing process, so I'm going back to make this quick announcement, float this idea past you really quick, and it's after this entire episode has been recorded, the whole thing is just a mess. Anyway, here's why I'm interrupting the program. So, along the way, in the past few episodes, and certainly in the future as we keep going, I'm going to come across events and people and ideas that I find absolutely fascinating, but don't really have the time to get into because it'll take too much away from the story of Timur. Now, one of these events that I've come across is this, the sack of Baghdad, the siege and sack of Baghdad. I think it is absolutely fascinating. It is obviously important. It's one of the most important sieges in world history for sure. So, I don't know, I'm kind of interested in maybe devoting an entire episode to the siege and sack of Baghdad. Now, don't worry, this would be in addition to the regularly scheduled program. Now, I know we haven't had any sort of regularly scheduled program with this show thus far, but we should be getting back to that. And this is sort of an experiment. I don't know. I'm floating the idea. Let me know what you think. If you'd be interested in sort of like extra bonus episodes that really dive into a subject that we touched on but really didn't have the time to get into, such as the siege and sack of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258. Anyway, let me know if that's something that would interest you, because I very well might do it. And with that quick interruption, let's get back to the narrative. As you can imagine, the fall and destruction of Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate sent shockwaves throughout the world. And as you can also imagine, I'm sure different factions, different groups of people viewed this event differently. In the Christian world, especially among the Christians living in the Middle East, the fall of Baghdad was seen as pretty much the greatest thing since Jesus. This was, in their eyes, the utter destruction of one of their oldest enemies. And also, remember that the Caliph, the ruler of the Caliphate, he was supposed to be the heir to the Prophet Muhammad and the leader of all Muslims. Now, of course, what this title actually meant varied from era to era and from leader to leader, but nonetheless, the title of Caliph always held power and prestige among Muslims. And now the Caliph was gone, and the Caliphate was gone. This was seen as a huge victory for Christians who had been struggling against Muslims and the Caliphate for 400 years? 500 years? The fall of Baghdad was proof that God was on the Christian side of this struggle, or that's how they often viewed it at least. Now, one of these Christian groups in the area was, of course, the Armenians, who at this point in time were scattered all throughout the Middle East because they had basically been run out of their homeland centuries earlier, out of where is today more or less what we call Armenia, and that is very debatable still today. Tensions are still very hot, but back in the 13th century, as we've talked about before, yes I know, the political strength of the Armenians was mostly situated in southeastern Turkey in the region of Cilicia. And one of these such Armenians, a man by the name of Kyriakos, wrote this about the fall of Baghdad. Throughout its supremacy, and this is Baghdad he's talking about, throughout its supremacy, like an insatiable leech, it had swallowed up the entire world. Now it restored all that had been taken. It was punished for the blood it had shed and the evil it had done. The measure of its sin was full. And this was fascinating to me because up far to the north, remember last episode, the Golden Horde has just been cutting its way through Russia, through Poland, through Hungary. There are Mongol raiding parties making it as far as Vienna and Austria, to the gates of Adrianople and Constantinople and Thrace. Nothing can stop them, and thus the Christians here, Germans, Russians, Poles, Greeks, Hungarians, and so on and so forth, they see the Mongols as the scourge of God, the apocalypse, the devil's legions personified. Now compare that to the south, where the Ilkhanate under Hulagu has just destroyed the arguably most important city in all of the Islamic world. Now, yes, the Christian kingdoms of Georgia and Cilician Armenia had been defeated and subjected to the Mongols, but relations between them and the Mongols quickly improved in a lot of ways. Like we learned, Hulagu was a Buddhist, but very, very sympathetic to Christianity and to the Georgians and Armenians. The only people worse than Mongols were their old Islamic rivals. And thus, throughout the history of the Ilkhanate, and yes, even here with the fall of Baghdad, you have Georgian and Armenian Christian knights and warriors fighting alongside the Mongols. Which is just interesting to me because up in the north, you have the Christians viewing the Mongols as the scourge of God, and yet down here you have so many Christians joining the Mongols. And similarly, the Mongols themselves were very religiously diverse. It's kind of a bad term to refer to them as Mongols because ethnically, culturally, and religiously, they were much more diverse than that. Hulagu's army included thousands and thousands of, yes, Mongol horsemen, but also Turkish horsemen, Persian infantry, Chinese machinery, certainly some Russian mercenaries or princes. It's a very multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious force, which goes back to that off-script moment I had where it's not black and white religiously speaking, although religion does play a big part in this. Anyway, this is a rabbit trail. I don't even know where I'm going. Okay, back to where we were sometime along this whole thing. Baghdad has fallen, and the Christians in the area, for the most part, yes, they rejoice. Armenians and Georgians begin to flock to Hulagu's banners, and remember that there are still Catholic crusaders in the area as well. Now, granted, the days of power for the crusaders are coming to an end, and right now, these crusader states are mostly a loose contingent of scattered fortresses and cities. But some of them, such as the Principality of Antioch, immediately ally with Hulagu because sure, the Mongols are scary and a threat to us, but the Muslim powers are even more of a threat to us, and they have been for centuries, and maybe with the Mongol help we can take them out now. So we've talked about the Mongols, we talked a little bit about the Christians, let's look over to the Muslims now. First of all, remember that you'll hear things like the Islamic world. I think one of the quotes I used earlier used the phrase Islamic world. And they use this to refer to the Islamic political structure, but the Muslims at this point in time are anything but united. And oftentimes the various Islamic powerhouses could be found fighting one another rather than, say, the Crusaders or now the Mongols. The Seljuk or Seljuk Empire had united, and I use that term very loosely, but they had united much of the Middle East in the 11th century for a brief moment But then, as nomadic empires often do, it fractured into dozens of tiny warring Turkish states. And yes, we're going back in time. I didn't write this out well, but I'm just trying to illustrate how fractured the Middle East is at this time. The Abbasid Caliphate, which, yes, I know we just covered its destruction, but bear with me, the Abbasid Caliphate, by the arrival of the Mongols, was a sliver of the global empire it had once been. Then there was, of course, the Ayyubids in Egypt and Syria, the Assassins in western Iran, the Khwarezmians, the Ghurids in Afghanistan, and then, of course, on top of all this, there are all sorts of religious denominations really identifying their distinctive differential qualities and beliefs at this point within Islam. You, of course, have the Sunni and the Shia, obviously, but also groups like the Ismailis, or another denomination which was basically Islamic polytheism. All of this to say, the Islamic world was not united at all, be that politically, legally, or militarily. And you did have certain leaders, such as Zengi, or Nuruddin, or most famous of all, Saladin, as he's known to the West, and they would manage to unite much of the Islamic world, but not most of it, and certainly not all of it, and definitely not for a long time. Why am I pressing this point? Okay. Well, despite not being united, most Muslims throughout the world were now freaking out with utter terror. The Caliph, even if they didn't really follow him, he was still this icon of the power of Islam. The Caliphate, even if it was not that powerful, it carried the name of Caliphate. And now they were both gone, destroyed, annihilated by a foreign, pagan, barbarian army. As one historian so perfectly sums this all up into one sentence, he says, "The fall of Baghdad had plunged the Muslim world into a state of terror. Now it was Muslims who began preaching about the end of the world and the scourge of God descending upon them. The Christians were doing this up in Europe when they faced the Mongols, and now the Muslims are doing it in the Middle East because all hope seems lost. Now the answer is pretty much clear. Submit to these pagan foreigners who are clearly enemies of God, but submit to them or die." Well, if you're a leader of one of these smaller Turkish sultanates and you're situated directly in the path of Hulagu's oncoming forces, the answer is probably pretty clear. You do not sleep, you do not rest until Hulagu knows that you are a loyal servant. And this is actually what we see. The Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia, they were subject to Hulagu, well, they sent word along with many gifts to reiterate the fact that, yeah, dude, we are your loyal servants, okay? We are not thinking of rebellion. It hasn't even crossed our mind. Please just spare us. The Atabeg of the mighty fortress of Mosul, which is in modern-day Iraq, and situated pretty close to Baghdad. Well, this guy, he had actually been sheltering a few officers and administrators of the former Abbasid Caliphate who had fled to him seeking sanctuary. Yeah, well, with the fall of Baghdad, he promptly executes them all, puts their heads on spears, puts those spears on the wall so that Hulagu can see them, and then he goes running to Hulagu in person to bend the knee. There was this other Turkish lord, and this story could very well be a legend, but it captures the sentiment, the terror of the world at this point. So I'm going to share it anyway. And this guy, he supposedly had custom boots made with paintings of his face on the bottom of these boots. And he gave these boots to Hulagu to show that, look man, I'm so loyal and I know my place in this world so well that I want you to figuratively step on me wherever you go. Again, this is probably a myth, but the terror and appeasing attitude shown in this story was sweeping like wildfire through the Islamic world as we've been calling it. So far, Hulagu has pretty much been nailing what his brother Monk had told him to do. Go to Iran, make sure that you can stabilize things there, take out the assassins, take out the caliphate, make sure that our client states of Armenia, Georgia, and the Sultanate of Rum are still loyal, and then destroy the Ayyubids in Syria and Egypt. And other than that last point, Hulagu has succeeded in all of this, and he's done it pretty effectively. Not only that, but Hulagu has brought a new level of structure to these Mongol territories, and it's here that we can really start to accurately designate these lands as the Ilkhanate. because Hulagu takes the title of Ilkhan, which I think we covered this earlier, but it basically means subordinate Khan. And then he designates a new capital for this region, the Ilkhanate, and this capital is the city of Tabriz, which is today western Iran. And then he begins to enforce laws and rules about taxation, religious tolerance, rebuilding, trade, things like that. And under Hulagu, much of the realm, but especially Persia, which remember was just previously an absolute wasteland after the Mongol conquests, well, under Hulagu, Persia begins to rebuild, and they rebuild fast. In fact, many Muslim Persians of the time viewed this period as a revival of culture, a Persian Renaissance even. Persian astronomers, poets, mathematicians, architects, philosophers, they start to flourish once again. And now that Baghdad was gone, which had been such an intellectual capital in the world, Persian cities really start to gain from it tremendously in a weird way. They start to become these new cultural capitals. And this is important, and this is off script again, but this will be important when Timur shows up on the scene because Timur really cares about artists and artisans and things like that. And when he comes into Persia, he is going to see how culturally vibrant these cities are, and he is going to take note about that. But getting ahead of myself, I'm getting off script. I've had too much coffee. My wife is going to get home with the puppy soon, which means that there will be no more recording when that happens. We got to get through this. Here we go. But as good as a lot of this sounds, not all is going well for Hulagu and his brand new Ilkhanate. First of all, and we covered it a few episodes back, but here it is again, Monk Khan dies in the year 1259, and this plunges the Mongol Empire into civil war between Kaidu and Kublai, and then another civil war down the line, and like we covered earlier, again, a lot of this is review, Hulagu and his Khanate side with Kublai. But this means that Hulagu now had enemies to the north and to the east. Instead of just being able to focus on the west, further expansion, stomp out the Egyptians, now he has to focus pretty much on all fronts. The Chagatai Khanate to the east quickly becomes enemies, and from here on out, from about the year 1260 to maybe 1320, sometime in the 1320s, the Chagatai Khanate and the Ilkhanate are pretty much constantly at war. Now, this certainly isn't constant war, despite what I just said. It wanes and it grows with different seasons and rulers, but tensions are pretty darn high between these two Mongol realms during all those years, and this pretty much doesn't end for like 60 years. So getting back to 1260, Hulagu now has to defend his realm from the Chagatai Khanate in the east. And what we talked about last episode is that full-on war breaks out between the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde from up there in the north. And this conflict, if you'll remember, is typically called the Berk-Hulagu War. So now Hulagu has to focus forces to the north, to the east, and to the west. But remember that Hulagu still has that one big item on his to-do list. He has to take out or subjugate the Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt and Syria. Now, yes, his brother who gave him this to-do list has died, but this is obviously the next target for expansion. They're kind of, I don't know, the cherry on top of this Middle Eastern Mongolian conquest. So let's talk about these Ayyubids, as I've been calling them. Well, we're going to go back in time again, and this goes back to Saladin a couple decades earlier, and Saladin is typically regarded as the founder of the dynasty, and if you don't know Saladin's story, basically his military and political career summed up into two sentences is he unified much of what we would call today Syria with Muslim Egypt, and this meant that his new realm surrounded the Crusaders on the Levant coast, which gives him the power to later annihilate a Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin. He recaptured Jerusalem for the Muslims, he held off the Third Crusade, and he even took parts of Arabia and Yemen, not from the Crusaders, but other Islamic powers. He's an incredible guy, deserves his own podcast for sure, but for our purposes, he died. His empire, known as the Ayyubids, it survived. It kept much of the power that he had established, but with outside threats along with civil war and a couple bad rulers, eventually it led to the Mamluks, a class of slave soldiers, taking control of the realm. Now, again, we talked about the Mamluks some episodes ago. They were slaves taken as boys and trained to do nothing but fight, and as such, they were by far the best soldiers in the entire Middle East, equal to none except maybe the finest Crusader Knights, but possibly even better than them. They're this group of exceptional warriors, right? Well, now here come the Mongols under Hulagu. Baghdad is taken. You have all of these little Turkish sultanates submitting to him. Most of the Christian powers in the region are allying with him. The Mamluks, who took over the Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt and Syria, the Mamluks stand alone. And then things only get worse for them. In the year 1259 and 1260, the armies of the Ilkhanate plunge into Mamluk territory in Syria. In 1260, the powerful fortress of Aleppo falls and its people are slaughtered. In March of that same year, the people of Damascus just flat out open their gates to the Mongols because they've given up on their Mamluk lords for protection. Most of Syria is just quickly overrun and captured by the Mongols. And now there are Mongol patrols plunging as far south as Jerusalem, as Gaza, to the very gates of Egypt, gazing greedily into Egypt to the land of the Nile, looking to take the heartland of Mamluk power. And guess what? It only gets worse. A man by the name of An-Nasir Yusuf, who was the Sultan of the Mamluks, he might have been a king. I had two different sources disagree on this, but nonetheless, he was a powerful and important leader of the Mamluks. Well, he goes out to face a Mongol contingent. He promptly, there we go, loses the battle. He's captured by the Mongols. He's taken in chains before Hulagu, and shortly thereafter, he is executed. Now, soldiers and officers and administrators and the people of Egypt are freaking out in fear even more because, look, the Mongols are unstoppable, and we've seen this in China, we've seen this in Russia, we've seen this in Hungary. It's the same sentiment. Nothing can stop the Mongols. We need to submit or we're going to be slaughtered. We need to just fall before Hulagu and beg for his mercy because otherwise all hope is lost. And then on top of all this, a civil war erupts in Egypt, and this has actually been going on off and on again for a few years between the Mamelukes, this class of slave soldiers, and the old Ayyubid aristocratic loyalists. So that's not important. Needless to say, Hulagu and the Ilkhanate have problems of their own. Sure, they're fighting a three-front war. I can't talk. That's not one of their problems. It's one of my problems. They might have problems, but Egypt, the Mamluks, the Ayyubid dynasty, they are downright suffocating with problems. And then the impossible happens. While civil war is raging at home, one Mamluk officer leads an army to hopelessly stand against a Mongol force, which is somewhere between 10 and 20,000 men. It's not the main contingent of the Ilkhanate army, but it's still a formidable and deadly army to be sure. But so this guy, he marches out there, and he's going to fight the Mongols. It's probably hopeless, but he's gonna do it. And he's typically referred to as Baybars. And I do apologize if that's not the most accurate way of saying his name. I'm sure it's not. I'm sure that I'm butchering most of these names. As I said earlier, I mess up even simple English names, so it's just gonna happen. I'm sorry. Please bear with me. Anyway, so Baybars and his elite warriors, his Mamluks, they decide to, push all the chips into the center of the table, throw everything they've got against the forces of the Ilkhanate. And so, the two armies meet at this little area called the Spring of Goliath, or Ain Jalut. And the Mamluks, at this battle, crush the Mongols. Now, yes, I know. We've talked about this battle before, but we're talking about the Ilkhanate today, and these Mongols, who were just defeated, are part of the Ilkhanate army. And now the year is 1260, and a Mongol army has been crushed, has been defeated. Suddenly, all bets are off the tables. What is this sentence that I wrote? Okay, let's work through it. Suddenly, all bets are off. I didn't add a comma. Suddenly, all bets are off, the tables are overturned, and somebody is finally able to bring the Mongol offensive to a screeching halt. And this man is Baybars. So let's talk about this guy Baybars and what he does next. Well, first of all, he has to solve this thing at home. So he rushes back to Egypt to get everything worked out there. And he stomps out the Ayyubid loyalist nonsense. We're done with this. It's a new era. It is the time of the Mamluks. We are now firmly in control. So what's next? Now it's time to take the fight back to the Mongols. Isn't this great? We now have somebody who's not just defending successfully against the Mongols. He did that. Now he's about ready to punch back. I love it. We finally have someone who can stand up against them. And this man is Baybars. So what does he do next? Let's find out. Baybars goes on the offensive. Mamluks, sharpen your swords and axes, count your arrows, gather your horses. We are marching to war. And so Baybars and the Mamluks march east, and marching east quickly leads them to Crusader territory. Now remember, at first, the Crusaders had viewed the Mongol invasions pretty favorably, but that had been at first. After seeing how seemingly invincible the Mongols were, Crusader sentiment sort of shifted. Add to this the fact that Pope Gregory IV flat out banned the Crusaders from allying with the Mongols for a number of reasons, but most of all because the Mongols were busy slaughtering Christians up north in Europe. Now, we know that was the Golden Horde and not the Ilkhanate, but to the Pope, to Latin Christians, Mongols were Mongols. So the Crusaders they're weaker than both the Mongols and the Mamluks. Mr. Pope says we can't take the side of the Mongols. So what do? Well, for the most part, the various Crusader states decide to wait it out. Let the big boys fight it out, and then maybe we can jump in at a time that would best benefit our position. But the Crusaders do allow Baybars and the Mamluks to march through their lands, and even give them some supplies along the way. But now the Mamluks can march through our lands and get to the Mongols, attack them, and the Crusaders are content with just seeing where the dice will land. So Baybars does just that. He marches north through the Crusader territory and then gets into Syria, land that had formerly belonged to, well, not to him, but to the Mamluks who had ruled before him. So he gets to Syria and he retakes Damascus. No Mongols in sight, because most of them are on the northern and eastern borders of the Ilkhanate fighting other Mongol Khanates. So Baybars he keeps going. He goes through Syria, retaking cities and fortresses, and then he crosses into Cilicia, where the Armenians are. And these Armenians, they are allies with the Mongols, the Ilkhanate Mongols. There are so many different types of Mongols. Oh, this gets confusing. Okay, so Baybars goes into Cilicia, Armenia, and he unleashes his forces on the Armenians. He defeats a few of their armies, and he goes pillaging and sacking most of the important cities in the area. And then, as quickly as the Mamluks had come, they left, traveling back to Syria before any sort of Mongol relief force could get there to help their subjects, the Armenians. So suddenly, in a matter of a handful of years, the Ilkhanate is backpedaling and doing everything it can just to stay standing. And then Hulagu dies. He dies on February 8th, 1265, and this throws the Ilkhanate into further chaos. Now that Baybars doesn't have to really worry about the Mongol threat quite as much, he turns his focus onto the Crusader states. In 1268, the Mamluks take the city of Antioch from the Crusaders, and then they just keep marching down the coast. And I decided not to list every Crusader and city and fortress. What a terrible sentence. It's late in the night, forgive me. I decided not to list every Crusader city and fortress that Baybars took because he took so many of them. Not all of them, for sure, but many of them. And so many of the surviving Crusader states that weren't taken, they cry to Europe for help, and the papacy toys with the idea of a new crusade. But most of Europe is getting tired of these crusades. Crusades almost never work, and even when they do, the death toll is like 70 to 80%. So yeah, it's time to move on from the crusades. So there will still be a few crusades, but by and large, it was the beginning of the end of the era of crusading. And actually, there was one Christian at the time, I believe a priest. He may have been a soldier. I can't remember. But he wrote about how the Christians in the Levant viewed the Mamluks, viewed Baybars, this new threat, this unstoppable tide, and not the one they were expecting. If anything, it would be the Mongols who would be taking them out. But no, it's the Mamluks, their old enemy, who are now there at their gates, taking back these cities and fortresses. So this Christian guy, he writes about this, and in this quote, he uses the phrase Turks, but this is, of course, referring to the Mamluks, so just remember that. And he says, anyone who wishes to fight the Turks is mad, for Jesus Christ does not fight them anymore. They have conquered, they will conquer, for every day they drive us down, knowing that God, who was awake, sleeps now. Anyway, Baybars is such a fascinating guy, and he too deserves his own podcast, of course, but here are a few just kind of bullet points of other incredible things that he managed to do in his lifetime. In 1272, he expanded his realm southwards by subjugating the Christian kingdom of Makuria in what's today northern Sudan and southern Egypt. He also allied with the Golden Horde Khanate up in the Russian steppe, and this alliance really helped establish Islam as the dominant faith of the Golden Horde. Of course, there were many Muslims living in the Golden Horde. They even had a few Islamic leaders. But now that they had this tie with Egypt, it helped increase Islamic fervor up in the Golden Horde's territory. He also, and this is kind of neat, Baybars experimented with hand cannons in combat, which is just, they're kind of early guns, but clumsy as hell. They sort of look like mini cannons because, remember, gunpowder is slowly coming onto the scene at about this point, and the way warfare works, it's still in favor of bows and swords and spears, but no one really knows what gunpowder will be, how important it'll be, how it works. Well, Baybars was one of the first guys to really experiment with it and to push these experiments forward, so that's pretty neat. He also built up the infrastructure of Egypt and Syria and the Levant. And then in 1277, he and the Mamluks decided to attack the Mongols again, but by doing so by attacking one of their client states, this being the Turkish Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia. So the Mamluks march north, they defeat the Turks, a Mongol relief army shows up, the two clash, the battle actually gets to the point where it could tip in either's favor, but then the Mamluks manage to pull ahead, and then they, again, defeat the Mongols. Then Baybars and his troops, they start to return home, and I wish we could know what could have happened had Baybars lived longer, what he could have done. But alas, as is so often the case in this time period, just as a new, effective, amazing leader is picking up speed, he dies. And Baybars died in 1277, possibly from a sickness or a wound. But another theory is that he accidentally drank poison that was meant for somebody else. I don't know. I've made stupid mistakes too, so I won't judge. Anyway, again, Baybars, he deserves more attention, but we need to get back to the Ilkhanate and find out what happens after Hulagu's death. So let's back to the year 1265. Hulagu is dead, and he leaves the Ilkhan throne to his son Abaka. Abaka rules the Ilkhanate from 1265 to 1282, and he does the best with what's been handed him, because now that Hulagu is dead, all of the Ilkhanate's old enemies press in harder than ever. Burke and the Golden Horde press in from the north, but then Burke dies like we talked about last episode, and that war sort of sizzles out. In the east, the Ilkhanate is always sort of fighting the Chagatai Khanate, so Abaka attacks them, defeats the Chagatayid army in 1270, and then manages to pretty much, more or less, hold the line in the east. So then he moves his attention to the west against the Mamluks. And before moving forward with this, Abaka approaches the age-old enemy of the Mamluks, the Crusaders. Hey guys, it's me, Abaka. I know you want to take out the Mamluks, so do we. Let's form an official alliance, finally. And Abaka really wants an alliance with the Christian powers, so much so that he sends diplomats to the Pope, to the Kingdom of Aragon in Spain, in what's today Spain, to the Kingdom of England, And these messages are usually met with polite apologies. Look, man, we're busy at home. We're pretty much tired with crusading. We don't really want to form a new crusade to help you. Except wait, somebody does. King Edward I of England decides that now would be a good time to go crusading. So he gets his boys together, they sail on over to the Holy Land, and there's going to be this grand alliance between the Mongols and these English crusaders to take out the Mamluks. And pretty quickly, these English crusaders formulate a peace treaty with the Mamluks for 10 years. And then after those 10 years, this gets renewed for another 10 years. So all this to say, Abaka and the Ilkhanate Mongols, they're not going to get much help from the Crusaders because this whole truce thing is going on between the Crusaders and the Mamluks. Now, there is this odd fact that there were about 200 Knights Hospitallers, who was a crusading knightly order. There's about 200 of these guys, and for some reason, they deemed themselves exempt from the truce that held all the other crusaders kind of hostage to this truce. That's a bad way of putting it, but they were like, yeah, the 200 of us, we don't need to follow this truce. So actually, yeah, we'll join the Mongols to fight the Mamluks. So that's just a weird fun fact. I don't know what they were thinking, but anyway, so Abaka and the Ilkhanate attack the Mamluks, and things go poorly. The Mongols are defeated by the Mamluks in 1277 at the Battle of Elbistan, and then again in 1281 at the Second Battle of Homs, and then a few months later, Ilkhan Abaka dies from some sort of alcohol-related issue on April 1st, 1282, and so the Ilkhan throne goes to his brother, Tekuder. Now, Tekuder is interesting because unlike Abaka and Hulagu, Tekuder is a devout Muslim, and he begins his rule by allying with the Islamic Mamluks, who his predecessors had been fighting for years, but I mean, okay, Tekuder, you do you. I get it. You share a common faith. You want to kind of rebuild a peaceful Islamic Middle East. That makes sense. But then Tekuder starts trying to force his own people and his own subjects to convert to Islam, and this really pisses off the old Mongol Buddhist and Christian aristocracy. So a revolution plan is quickly put together, and these guys think, let's replace Tekuder with our own traditional candidate, a dude by the name of Argun, and maybe we can even get Kublai Khan's help from China. Well, Kublai likes the idea, but he's way too far away and he's busy with his own things, so he basically tells the Ilkhanate, hey, figure out your problems, and I'll probably approve of whoever you elect, but just figure out your own problems, I'm too far away. So this means that civil war occurs between Tekuder, a devout Muslim who wants to make the Ilkhanate more Muslim, and then the traditionalist Mongol Argun, who wants to keep more of the old policies. Long story short, Tekuder captures Argun, but then Tekuder's son pities Argun, frees him from captivity, and then Argun gathers his own forces, battles Tekuder again, defeats him, executes him, blah blah blah, and then he becomes the fourth Ilkhan of the Ilkhanate. And Argun Ilkhan would rule from 1284 through 1291. And now, backing way up to the beginning of this long-winded, long episode, I did not think it would be this long. We have to go back to when I said that the plight of the Ilkhanate is kind of a murder mystery of how the whole thing collapsed. Well, yeah, you can probably see that there are some pretty big cracks in the empire, in the Khanate at this point. So Argun Ilkhan he's more of a traditional Mongol ruler, and as such he does all he can to continue warring against outside Islamic factions like the Mamluks. But he's also fighting the growing Islamic influence within his own empire. Again, trying to keep old Mongol ideas of, religious tolerance, but especially focusing on the old Buddhist and shamanist traditions. The problem with this new policy is that it's expensive business. And again, he's constantly at war too. So to cope with this, Argun raises taxes, he starts centralizing the empire, and this gets him murdered by people who had previously been his supporters. So then the throne of the Ilkhanate goes to the fifth Ilkhan, a man by the name of Gaikatu. And Gaikatu Well, he would rule from 1291 through 1295, but he is best remembered for being addicted to wine, women, and sodomy. So not a great ruler. He did try to introduce paper money to the Ilkhanate, but this goes nowhere. It actually causes merchants and traders to riot in the streets in a few cities, so that program is immediately canceled. Meanwhile, this rift between the population majority of Muslims and the old Mongol Buddhist aristocracy is only getting larger. But if there's one thing that these two groups agree on, it's that you can't have sexual relations with younger boys, which is, allegedly, what Gaikatu was found doing. He gets what he deserves, though, and is promptly strangled to death with a bowstring. The Ilkhan throne then goes to the 6th Ilkhan, Gaikatu's cousin, a man named Baidu, who lasts about a year and then he's killed. So then the throne goes to Gaikatu's son, Ghazan Ilkhan, and Ghazan rules from 1295 through 1304. He becomes a devout Muslim. He orders that Islam becomes the official state religion of the Ilkhanate, but if you want to practice Buddhism or Christianity or anything else, that's fine too. So here we go, back to kind of a policy of religious tolerance. That's good, it's going to stabilize things. And this guy also starts minting some new coins. He takes a census of his people. Things start to stabilize. He eases tensions with the Golden Horde in the north. Good. He holds off the Chagatai Khanate in the east. Good. He sends an army to attack the Mamluks, and the Mongols actually win this battle, which is also good for the realm. And then he dies in 1304. Again, as soon as someone starts picking up speed and putting the pieces back together, they die. History is weird like that. So after him comes the 8th Ilkhan, Oljatu, who ruled from the year 1304 through 1316. And he carries out some programs to further stabilize the realm a bit more. Then in 1308, he actually allies with the Byzantine Empire, who is still around, although we haven't really heard from them much. But the Byzantine Empire is still around, they're still doing things, and they actually need help, like always actually. They need help fighting the Turks in Anatolia. So the Mongols, the Ilkhanate Mongols, and the Byzantines join forces and defeat the Turks, who are led... The Turks are led by a pesky guy by the name of Osman. And if you don't recognize that name, well, Osman is probably the founder of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire will become just a little important to our story later on when we get to Timur's later years, so just kind of remember that. Anyway, so back to old Jaitu Khan, or Ilkhan. He dies in 1316, so there's not much more there. So next up is his son, Abu Sa'id, the 9th and last Ilkhan of the Ilkhanate. But Abu Sa'id was actually a pretty outstanding ruler. He ruled from 1316 to 1335, which is a pretty long time compared to many former Ilkhans, and despite the fact that throughout his reign the Ilkhanate was just constantly riddled with uprisings and rebellions, Abu Sa'id managed to hold it together. And he also became a great patron of the arts, and the Ilkhanate went through a sort of golden age in the early 14th century, largely due to his patronage. But, as I'm sure you're coming to realize, the cracks in the Ilkhanate are becoming too large, too many, too fast. The Muslim majority are sick and tired of being ruled by the Buddhist and Christian minority, which, it's much more complicated than that. There were Muslims ruling parts of the empire, but there were still these Buddhists and old Christian Mongols who wanted to, revert back to traditional Mongol standards and rules. Then, of course, you also have the Mamluks and the Chagatai Khanate, who are just constantly threatening both sides of the Khanate from the west and the east. Rebellions are constant, and then the subject of next episode occurs. And I don't want to give it away, but I guess I don't really see any way around it. So, and again, you probably know what's coming anyway. Here's what happens. Just when the Ilkhanate is sort of on its last leg, the Black Death hits. The bubonic plague is here. Now, we're going to get into this plague and what it meant for the world in great detail next week, and it's going to be very interesting, but here's how it matters to us right now. Persia, Central Asia, and the Middle East were some of the areas hit hardest by the plague. The Ilkhanate, struggling to stay afloat, gets the last nail driven in hard. The entire realm is just ravaged by death. And worst of all, the Ilkhan, Abu Sa'id, this guy who showed a lot of promise, he gets sick from the plague, and then he dies. Because the weird thing about the plague is it doesn't discriminate on class. It wipes out everybody regardless of how much money you have, how religious you are, what language you speak, what religion you're following. So Abu Sa'id dies, and then his sons die. And in fact, every male relation to him died from the plague. So the year is now 1335, and the Ilkhanate has no clear successor to the throne, and it just vanishes. You'll sometimes see the end date of the Ilkhanate extend as late as 1356, and that's fair because there were still parts of the empire that claimed that, we're the real Ilkhanate or whatever. But by and large, by 1335, most of the former Ilkhanate had fractured into about a dozen or so much smaller, much weaker political entities. Now, I know this is sudden, but that's just how it happened. The entire collapse just occurs all together. The fragments of the Ilkhanate were barely being held together as it was, and then the plague just dashed the realm to pieces. Now, we'll talk about the plague next week, and I know that's a pretty depressing way to leave off, but let me just give you a quick glimpse into Timur's story, because the interesting thing about Timur is he comes at a point in time where, and I'm going to use this phrase a lot in the future, so get ready for it. I'm going to use the phrase power vacuum. Now, you know what a power vacuum is. It just means that somewhere, sometime, there was an entity or a person holding so much together, and then when that person or entity vanished, there's just sort of chaos or anarchy as so many other people try to fill that void but fail. And with the story of Timur, what's fascinating to me, and I keep on coming across more and more power vacuums, but that's just it, is he comes at a time and a place where there are so many power vacuums. Religiously, politically, militarily, so many things, huge empires had come right before him, and then they collapsed, leaving him to pick up the pieces. Now, of course, it's much more complicated than that, but let's look at this for a second. I mean, most of the lands of the Ilkhanate will later be conquered by Timur. And this would just be a few years later. I mean, it's 1335, the Ilkhanate is gone. Some accounts say that Timur is born by now. Now, we'll get into his birth date because that's pretty contentious. But that's the thing, is the Ilkhanate is now just a bunch of little tiny pieces. This is a conqueror's dream come true. Now, add to the fact that the Black Death has just ravaged pretty much the entire world at this point. Again, that makes more power vacuums. Now, another power vacuum is that the caliphate is gone. This kind of theoretical leader of Islam the caliph has been killed, the caliphate is gone, and there are a lot of Muslims looking for something to fill that void, and Timur is going to come along and say, look, I'm not the caliph, but I am something pretty close. And then, of course, on top of all of this is the Mongol Empire is fracturing into the four khanates. Those khanates are fracturing. There are so many places where there's such a clear power vacuum. Timur is going to fill that so quickly. It is perfect for him. He takes advantage of all these scenarios. I'm getting way ahead of myself, but I'm just getting so excited because we are almost to his life, to his story. It's going to be great. But again, you can kind of see the Ilkhanate sets this road for Timur to conquer its own territories because it collapses just a few years before he gets to the scene. And it doesn't give all of these other political entities time enough to pick up their pieces, kind of formulate themselves as strong political factions or whatever, because before they can do that, Timur's already here. Okay, that was a rant. It is really late at night. My neighbors, I'm sure, want to kill me. That's about it. I think there's a lot more to say about the Ilkhanate, but I think this is pretty good. We'll touch back on it as we go forward. As one of the books I was reading pointed out, that we don't have too many sources on the Ilkhanate. Now, there are plenty, thankfully, but again, with the instability within the realm, coupled with the Black Death, not a lot of people were too interested in writing things down. Now, later you have people who kind of look back at the Ilkhanate and say, wow, they actually did some incredible things. And a lot of what we see built in the Ilkhanate, you'll see later within the Ottoman Empire. They kind of adopt a lot of these former ideas. With later Persian dynasties, you see some of these ideas live on. But by and large, I don't know, it's a summary pretty good enough for me. So that's pretty selfish of me, but that's what we're going to go with. And with that, I think that brings this episode to a close. If you've made it this far in the episode, thank you so much for pressing through. I'm so glad that you're with me on this journey to go back and look at this. Okay, I'm getting so nerdy right now. This stuff just makes me so excited and giddy. Anyway, thank you for listening to this episode. Next week, we're going to look at the bubonic plague and what that means for the years coming, the power vacuums that it will create or help establish that Timur will be left to kind of fill that void in a lot of ways. Anyway, if you want to reach me for any reason at any time, and I will respond to you, feel free to email me at timurpodcast@gmail.com, at Twitter at podcasttimur, or on Facebook at timurpod. There's also a website that I have at timurpodcast.com. There's not a whole lot on it, but there are a couple things. I don't know. Check it out if you're bored. I don't have many show notes up yet, but I hopefully will change that maybe if I have time. Also, if you like the idea of kind of those bonus episodes I was talking about earlier, let me know, because that is a very real possibility. I would love to just make a really long bonus episode on the Siege of Baghdad. That would be amazing. And other events too, and other people as well. So let me know if that interests you. Otherwise, thanks for listening. We will see you next week right here on the Timur Podcast.